The limestone cliffs above the Dead Sea are silent at dawn. The light arrives slowly here, spilling over the desert in thin, pale layers, touching rock before sand, and sand before the still water below. In the spring of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd moved along these cliffs looking for a lost goat. He carried no map, no sense that the ground beneath his feet held anything of consequence. When a stone slipped from his hand and disappeared into the mouth of a cave, the sound that came back was not the dull thud of rock on earth, but the sharp crack of pottery breaking in darkness. Inside that cave, sealed for nearly 2,000 years, lay fragments of texts long thought lost to time. Among them were pieces of a work few scholars in the West had ever read in full, a text known largely through references, quotations, and rumor, the Book of Enoch. This was not the discovery of a new religion, nor the unveiling of a forbidden doctrine. It was something quieter, and in many ways more unsettling, evidence that an ancient text, once widely read and taken seriously, had been part of the intellectual and religious world from which the Bible itself emerged, yet had somehow slipped out of the canon that later generations came to call Scripture. To understand why this matters, we have to step far back, beyond the caves of Qumran, beyond Christianity, beyond even the final shape of the Hebrew Bible, into the world of the ancient Near East where texts were fluid. Boundaries between myth, theology, and history were porous, and ideas moved freely across cultures and centuries. The figure at the center of the story is Enoch, a name that appears only briefly in the book of Genesis. He is not a king, not a lawgiver, not a patriarch in the usual sense. The biblical account devotes to him just a few lines. Enoch lived 65 years and fathered Methuselah. He walked with God. And then, unlike every other figure in the genealogy, he did not die. He was taken. For most readers, this passage passes quickly, barely noticed among the long lists of names and ages. But for ancient audiences, it posed a problem and an opportunity. What does it mean to walk with God? What does it mean not to die? And if Enoch did not die, where did he go? The Book of Enoch is one ancient answer to those questions. Or more precisely, it is a collection of answers, written over centuries by different authors, preserved and expanded by communities for whom Enoch was not a marginal figure, but a central witness to the structure of the cosmos itself. The text we call the Book of Enoch is not a single unified work. It is a composite made up of several distinct sections. Visions of heaven and earth, journeys through the cosmos, explanations of the movements of the stars, and narratives about beings who exist between the human and the divine. These sections were composed at different times, in different contexts, but they share a common voice, a worldview in which the universe is ordered, moral, and under constant threat of disruption. In this worldview, evil does not originate primarily from human weakness. It enters the world through knowledge misused, boundaries crossed, and hierarchies violated. Angels descend where they should not. Secrets are taught that humanity is not prepared to hold, and the result is corruption on a cosmic scale. This way of thinking did not emerge in isolation. The ancient Near East was saturated with stories of divine beings who interacted with humans, of gods who taught crafts, laws, and rituals, and of catastrophic consequences when divine order was disturbed. Mesopotamian myths spoke of Apkallu, semi-divine sages who brought civilization to humanity before the flood. Ugaritic texts described councils of gods who governed the world collectively. Egyptian traditions imagined a cosmos sustained by balance, constantly threatened by chaos. The authors of the Enochic texts were heirs to this intellectual environment, but they reshaped it. They stripped away polytheism, insisted on a single supreme God, and reframed older mythic patterns within a moral universe governed by judgment and accountability. One of the most striking sections of the Book of Enoch describes a group of beings known as the Watchers. According to the text, these were angels assigned to observe the world, to maintain order, to watch over humanity. Instead, they descended to earth, took human wives, and taught forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, enchantments, astrology. Their actions produced violence, inequality, and beings that did not belong fully to either realm. The narrative does not linger on spectacle. It is restrained, almost clinical in places. The emphasis is not on the monsters themselves, but on consequences. The earth becomes filled with blood. Human society destabilizes. Creation begins to fracture. This story may sound unfamiliar, even shocking to modern readers raised on later biblical traditions. But to ancient audiences, it offered an explanation for a question that had troubled thinkers for centuries. Why is the world so profoundly disordered if it was created good? The answer Enoch provides is not that humans alone failed. It is that the structure of the cosmos itself was violated. And once that line was crossed, no simple repair was possible. The Book of Enoch was not fringe literature in its own time. Fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls show that it was copied, read and valued by Jewish communities in the centuries before and after the turn of the era. Multiple copies appear in different caves, suggesting not a single eccentric group, but broad circulation. The language of the text, Aramaic in its earliest layers, places it firmly within the living intellectual world of Second Temple Judaism. It was a world in flux. Empires rose and fell. Persian rule gave way to Greek domination, which in turn yielded to Roman power. Each regime brought new pressures, new ideas, and new forms of control. For many Jewish communities, the question was no longer simply how to live well, but how to understand suffering, injustice, and delay in the fulfillment of divine promises. Apocalyptic literature flourished in this environment. These texts did not predict the end of the world in a modern sense. They revealed hidden structures. They claimed to show what lay behind history, the true forces at work, the unseen order that would eventually assert itself. The Book of Enoch is one of the earliest and most influential examples of this tradition. Its visions of judgment, cosmic, bookkeeping, and future restoration would echo through later Jewish writings and leave a clear imprint on early Christian thought. And yet, despite this influence, Enoch would not become part of the Hebrew Bible as it eventually solidified. Rabbinic Judaism, emerging in the centuries after the destruction of the Second Temple, favored texts that emphasized law, communal practice, and continuity. The speculative cosmology of Enoch, with its elaborate angelic hierarchies and detailed maps of heaven, sat uneasily within that framework. Christian communities faced similar questions. While early writers were clearly familiar with Enoch, one New Testament letter even quotes it directly, the process of canon formation gradually narrowed the boundaries of acceptable scripture. Texts that raised theological difficulties or that encouraged speculation beyond emerging doctrinal norms were set aside. This exclusion was not a single decision, nor a coordinated act of suppression. It was the slow result of debate, preference, and institutional consolidation. By the time biblical canons were formalized, the Book of Enoch existed largely outside them. But it did not disappear. In the highlands of Ethiopia, within a Christian tradition that developed along its own path, the Book of Enoch was preserved in full, translated into Ge'ez, and treated as scripture. For centuries, this version remained unknown to most of the world. European scholars doubted its existence, assuming references to Enoch pointed to a lost work beyond recovery. The caves of Qumran changed that assumption forever. What emerged from those fragments was not a curiosity, but confirmation. The Ethiopian text was not a medieval invention. It preserved, in translation, a body of literature whose roots reached deep into the ancient Near East. A voice once central, then marginalized, now audible again. And with that rediscovery came a challenge. Not to faith, but to simplicity. The past, it seemed, was more complex than the tidy boundaries later generations had drawn. The Bible did not emerge fully formed. It grew alongside other texts in conversation and tension with them. The Book of Enoch reminds us of that world, a world where angels could fall, knowledge could corrupt, and history itself was only one layer of a much larger cosmic story. This is not the story of a book that was banned or erased. It is the story of a book that belonged to its time, shaped its descendants, and then took a different path through history. In the chapters that follow, we will trace that path in detail. From the origins of the Enochic tradition, through its visions of heaven and judgment, to the reasons it was ultimately left outside the biblical canon, and what its survival tells us about the fragile, contested process by which sacred texts are formed. Long before Enoch became the narrator of cosmic journeys and celestial judgment, he existed as a problem embedded quietly within a genealogy. In the book of Genesis, his appearance is brief, almost abrupt. He is listed among generations that follow a rigid pattern: age, offspring, death, until the pattern breaks. Enoch does not die. He walks with God, and then he is gone. The text offers no explanation, no elaboration, and no commentary. In a literary tradition otherwise meticulous about lineage and mortality, the silence is conspicuous. For ancient readers, this silence was not empty. It invited interpretation. In the ancient Near East, gaps in authoritative texts were not obstacles. They were openings. They allowed later scribes, teachers, and communities to explore implications without claiming to invent new revelations. Expansion was not seen as distortion. It was understood as clarification. The Enochic tradition emerges from this space. Unlike figures such as Moses or David, Enoch is not tied to a nation, a law code, or a political order. He belongs to a time before tribes, before kings, before covenants are formalized. He is positioned in what later writers would describe as the antediluvian world, a human landscape closer to creation itself, less mediated by institutions, and therefore more exposed to the structure of the cosmos. This placement matters. It makes Enoch an ideal witness, someone who can plausibly move between realms without violating later theological boundaries. In ancient thought, proximity to origins conferred authority. Knowledge was believed to degrade over time, not improve. The farther one stood from creation, the more veiled truth became. By situating Enoch before the flood, before the reordering of the world, the authors of these texts granted him access to realities later generations could no longer see directly. This is why Enoch becomes a receiver rather than a lawgiver. He does not bring commandments down from a mountain. He is shown things. He is taken upward, outward, beyond the visible world, and instructed in how reality is organized beneath appearances. His authority lies not in power or leadership, but in perception. The Book of Enoch repeatedly emphasizes this role. Enoch is guided by angelic figures. He is shown storehouses of wind, repositories of snow and hail, pathways of the stars, and chambers prepared for the righteous and the condemned. These are not presented as metaphors. They are described as real structures within a morally ordered universe. This way of describing the cosmos reflects a broader intellectual shift occurring during the Second Temple period. As political autonomy diminished and foreign rule became the norm, explanations for suffering and injustice increasingly moved beyond immediate historical causes. If evil could not be fully accounted for by human failure or bad governance, then its roots had to be deeper, embedded in the fabric of the universe itself. Enoch's journeys provide a framework for that explanation. The world is not chaotic by accident. It is disordered because certain boundaries were crossed long ago, and the consequences of those violations continue to ripple through time. Importantly, Enoch is not portrayed as a rebel or a challenger of divine authority. He does not seize forbidden knowledge. He is invited into it. The text is careful on this point. Revelation is granted, not stolen. This distinction allows the authors to explore dangerous ideas about angels, judgment, and cosmic hierarchy without undermining the supremacy of God. In this sense, Enoch functions as a controlled lens. Through him, the text can reveal hidden dimensions of reality while maintaining theological discipline. He sees, records, and transmits, but he does not intervene. The choice of Enoch over other early figures is deliberate. Adam is too close to the act of creation itself, burdened with themes of innocence and fall. Noah is defined by survival and covenant. Enoch occupies a narrower, more flexible space. He is human, but uncorrupted by catastrophe. He is righteous, but not central to later legal traditions. He is close enough to the divine to travel, but distant enough to observe. This makes him uniquely suited to the genre of apocalyptic revelation. The literary form that develops around Enoch is not prophecy in the classical sense. It does not address kings or nations directly. It addresses time. Past, present, and future are collapsed into a single moral landscape. Judgment is certain, but delayed. Justice is absolute, but unseen. The task of the text is not to change policy, but to reshape perception. For communities living under imperial domination, this perspective was powerful. It suggested that history was not random, and that current suffering did not indicate divine absence. On the contrary, the world was being carefully measured, recorded, and prepared for a reckoning beyond human courts. Enoch becomes the scribe of this process. He is repeatedly described as writing down what he sees, preserving it for future generations. Writing itself becomes an act of resistance against oblivion. Knowledge is stored against the day it will finally make sense. This emphasis on recording reflects anxieties specific to the period. Texts were vulnerable. Temples could be destroyed. Oral traditions could fracture. Writing offered durability. By framing Enoch as the first great recorder of cosmic truth, the authors align their work with preservation rather than innovation. The authority of the Book of Enoch, then, does not come from institutional endorsement. It comes from narrative positioning. The text asks its audience to accept that some knowledge predates the structures that later claim exclusivity over revelation. It implies that what is canonical is not necessarily complete. This implication would later become uncomfortable. As religious traditions moved toward consolidation, the flexibility that allowed Enochic literature to flourish became a liability. Detailed angelologies, speculative cosmologies, and expansive visions of judgment risked destabilizing emerging doctrinal boundaries. A text that explained evil by tracing it to celestial rebellion raised questions that institutions were not eager to institutionalize. But in its original context, the Book of Enoch did not seek to disrupt. It sought to explain. It offered a map of reality that made sense of suffering without denying divine order. It reassured its readers that injustice was not invisible, and that history was not the final court of appeal. By choosing Enoch, silent in Genesis, absent from the flood narrative, untouched by later covenants, the authors created a figure who could carry this burden without contradiction. He belongs everywhere and nowhere. He stands at the edge of memory, looking inward and outward at once. In the chapters that follow, the visions attributed to Enoch will grow more detailed, more unsettling, and more specific. The watchers will descend. Knowledge will be weaponized. Judgment will be quantified. But all of it rests on this foundation, the selection of a witness whose very obscurity grants him credibility. Enoch is not important because he speaks often in the Bible. He is important because he does not, and because that silence left room for an entire cosmology to emerge. The world Enoch enters in his visions is not abstract. It is structured, layered, and governed by rules as precise as any legal code. Heaven, in these texts, is not a metaphor for transcendence. It is a place with geography, architecture, and administration. And at the center of this ordered universe stands a tension that defines the moral logic of the Book of Enoch: knowledge itself. In the ancient Near East, knowledge was never neutral. To know was to possess power, and power carried responsibility. Crafts, calendars, metallurgy, medicine, and divination were not merely skills. They were gifts that shaped societies. Myths across the region repeatedly warned that when such knowledge was introduced too early or without restraint, the result was imbalance. Civilization could be built or broken by what humans learned and when they learned it. The Book of Enoch radicalizes this concern by locating the origin of corruption not in human curiosity alone, but in a failure of cosmic discipline. According to the text, the Watchers were not minor beings. They were part of the heavenly order, tasked with oversight rather than intervention. Their role was observational, not instructional. They were meant to witness the unfolding of creation, not to reshape it. When they descend to earth, their crime is not desire alone. It is pedagogy. They teach. The knowledge they impart is specific and unsettling. The making of weapons, the working of precious metals, the art of cosmetics, the interpretation of celestial signs. These are not presented as inherently evil practices. What condemns them is context. Humanity receives tools without moral maturity, techniques without ethical restraint. The balance between power and wisdom collapses. Violence follows. Inequality deepens. The earth itself is described as crying out under the weight of what it has been made to bear. This framing is crucial. The Book of Enoch does not portray evil as chaos erupting spontaneously. It portrays it as order misapplied, systems functioning outside their intended domain, angels behaving like humans, humans wielding tools meant for gods. The universe in this telling is fragile not because it lacks structure, but because its structures can be misused. Enoch's role in this narrative is observational and judicial. He is shown the consequences of these transgressions, not to intervene, but to understand. His journeys take him across boundaries that humans were never meant to cross unaided. He sees prisons prepared for rebellious beings. He witnesses the mechanisms of judgment already set in motion, long before they are enacted in history. What is striking is the absence of urgency. Judgment is certain, but not immediate. Time itself becomes a moral instrument. Delay is not mercy alone. It is part of the sentence. The world must live with the consequences of corrupted knowledge until resolution arrives. This perspective reflects a deep anxiety within Second Temple Judaism. Political power lay elsewhere. Justice, as experienced daily, was inconsistent at best. The Enochic worldview responds by relocating justice beyond visible institutions. Courts fail, empires dominate, but the cosmos records everything. In this system, nothing is forgotten. Every action is measured against an order that predates human authority and will outlast it. The appeal of such a worldview is not difficult to understand. It offers moral stability in a world where social stability has collapsed. The emphasis on celestial record-keeping is especially telling. Enoch is repeatedly shown tablets, books, and ledgers maintained by angelic beings. History is not a sequence of accidents, it is an archive. This bureaucratic vision of the universe mirrors the imperial administrations under which these texts were written. Power is distant, opaque, and meticulous. Judgment arrives not suddenly, but procedurally. Yet unlike earthly empires, the cosmic order Enoch witnesses is portrayed as incorruptible. Angels cannot be bribed. Records cannot be altered. Time may delay justice, but it cannot erase it. The fall of the Watchers, therefore, serves two functions. It explains the origin of pervasive evil, and it reassures the reader that this origin has already been addressed at the highest level. The outcome is not in doubt. Only the timing remains unknown. This is not a theology of despair. It is a theology of endurance. By attributing the deepest roots of corruption to celestial rebellion, the Book of Enoch simultaneously absolves humanity of total blame and holds it accountable for participation. Humans did not create the conditions of corruption, but they live within them. They benefit from forbidden knowledge and suffer from its consequences. Responsibility remains, but it is contextualized. This nuanced moral landscape distinguishes Enochic thought from simpler dualisms. Evil is not an equal opposing force to good. It is a deviation, a misuse of hierarchy, a distortion of purpose. And because it is a deviation, it can be corrected. Enoch's visions do not invite rebellion against the world as it is. They invite patience. The reader is not called to overthrow rulers or withdraw from society. They are called to align themselves internally with an order that is currently hidden. This inward alignment is reinforced by the text's emphasis on righteousness as orientation rather than action alone. The righteous are those who see correctly, who understand where true authority lies. They may suffer now, but they are positioned correctly within the larger structure of reality. As the Book of Enoch develops, this structure becomes increasingly elaborate. Time itself is divided into weeks. History is segmented, measured, and evaluated. Nothing unfolds randomly. Even catastrophe follows a schedule. What begins as a story about angels descending becomes a comprehensive theory of history. Past transgression explains present disorder. Present endurance anticipates future restoration. Enoch stands at the intersection of these temporal layers, a witness positioned to see the whole arc at once. In later chapters, this vision will sharpen. Judgment will be described with greater specificity. Rewards and punishments will be allocated with precision. The universe will appear less like a mystery and more like a system approaching resolution. But the foundation remains the same, a cosmos structured by knowledge, damaged by its misuse, and sustained by a justice that operates beyond immediate human perception. The Book of Enoch asks its audience to accept a difficult proposition, that the world makes sense even when it feels unbearable, that suffering is not meaningless, even when its causes are obscured, and that history, though shaped by empires and violence, is ultimately subordinate to an order that cannot be overthrown. Enoch does not offer comfort in the present tense. He offers coherence. And for those living under uncertainty, coherence itself becomes a form of hope. By the time the Book of Enoch begins to circulate widely, the world that produced it is already fractured. Political independence has been lost, restored briefly, and lost again. Authority shifts hands repeatedly, each transition leaving scars on communal memory. In this environment, questions about power, who holds it, where it comes from, and how long it lasts, are no longer theoretical. They are urgent, lived concerns. The Enochic texts respond to this uncertainty by reframing power itself. Earthly rule is not denied, but it is diminished. Kings, priests, and empires operate within a narrower band of reality than they claim. Above them exists a parallel administration, older, slower, and ultimately decisive. The purpose of Enoch's visions is not to predict political events, but to relativize them. This shift is most visible in the way judgment is portrayed. In earlier biblical traditions, judgment often occurs within history. Cities fall, enemies are defeated, disasters strike. In the Book of Enoch, judgment is displaced. It is delayed, systematized, and relocated to a realm beyond immediate experience. This does not weaken it. It intensifies it. Enoch is shown places prepared in advance, spaces of containment, separation, and waiting. Souls are sorted, not yet punished or rewarded, but held in conditions that reflect their moral orientation. The language is careful. These are not final destinations. They are interim states. Justice unfolds in stages. This layered approach to judgment mirrors the political reality of the period. Decisions are made far away. Appeals take time. Outcomes are deferred. The Enochic worldview absorbs this structure and reinterprets it cosmically. Delay is no longer a sign of indifference. It is evidence of scale. What emerges is a universe governed less like a battlefield and more like a court. Evidence is gathered. Records are kept. Witnesses testify. Sentences are prepared, but not immediately executed. In this context, Enoch's role as recorder becomes central. He is not merely a traveler. He is a clerk of eternity. The emphasis on writing intensifies in these sections. Tablets appear repeatedly. Angels are described as scribes. Events are logged with precision. The cosmos itself is bureaucratic, but not arbitrarily so. Its procedures exist to ensure proportionality. Nothing is overlooked. Nothing is rushed. This vision would have resonated deeply with communities subjected to arbitrary human authority. Where earthly courts could be bribed or coerced, the heavenly court is presented as incorruptible. Where rulers could rewrite laws, cosmic order remains fixed. The appeal is not revolutionary, it is stabilizing. At the same time, this framework introduces a new kind of anxiety. If judgment is certain but delayed, then the present becomes a test without immediate resolution. Faith is no longer rewarded visibly. Righteousness does not guarantee protection. Instead, it guarantees placement, alignment with an outcome that lies beyond one's lifetime. The Book of Enoch addresses this tension by redefining success. Prosperity and power are decoupled from moral standing. The wicked may flourish temporarily. The righteous may suffer persistently. These conditions are not anomalies. They are expected features of a system in which final evaluation has been postponed. This postponement allows the text to speak to multiple generations at once. Its promises are not tied to specific events. They are structural. As long as injustice persists, the framework remains relevant. As long as history feels unresolved, the narrative holds. The figure of the watchers reappears here in a new light. Their punishment is not immediate annihilation. They are bound, confined, and made to wait. Their fate mirrors that of humanity, though on a different scale. They exist in suspension, aware of their sentence but unable to escape it. This symmetry reinforces the text's moral coherence. No being, human or angelic, is exempt from process. Authority does not erase accountability. Power does not accelerate judgment. Everything moves according to order. The communities that preserved and transmitted these texts did so not because they offered easy answers, but because they offered durable ones. The Enochic worldview does not promise rescue. It promises reckoning. It does not minimize suffering. It contextualizes it. In this sense, the Book of Enoch functions as a counter-history. It challenges the assumption that history is written by victors alone. True history, it suggests, is being written elsewhere, by hands that cannot be influenced by force. This idea carries a quiet radicalism. It undermines the ultimate authority of empires without calling for their overthrow. It weakens tyranny by refusing to grant it metaphysical significance. Rulers may dominate bodies, but they do not control outcomes. As these themes accumulate, the text begins to push against the boundaries of what later traditions would tolerate. The more elaborate the cosmic system becomes, the more it risks overshadowing simpler theological frameworks. The universe Enoch describes is vast, ordered, and deeply moral, but it is also crowded with intermediaries, procedures, and hierarchies. For later interpreters seeking clarity and unity, this complexity posed a problem. But in its original context, complexity was not a flaw. It was a reflection of reality as experienced. The world was complicated. Authority was layered. Justice was slow. Any theology that ignored these facts risked irrelevance. The Book of Enoch did not ignore them. It absorbed them and projected them onto the largest canvas imaginable. By the end of this phase of the narrative, the reader is no longer focused on individual transgressions or isolated visions. A system has emerged. A moral architecture now frames everything that follows. History, suffering, power, and hope have all been repositioned within it. What remains is to ask how such a system could coexist with emerging traditions that sought to streamline belief, limit speculation, and consolidate authority. The answer lies not in a single rejection, but in a gradual narrowing of acceptable imagination. In the chapters ahead, that narrowing will become visible. The same features that once gave the Book of Enoch its explanatory power will begin to count against it. and the question will no longer be what the text reveals, but whether institutions are willing to live with what it implies. As the Enochic tradition expanded, it did not remain static. New sections were composed, older ones reworked, and ideas refined in response to changing historical pressures. What began as visionary explanation gradually took on the shape of a comprehensive historical framework. Time itself became structured, segmented, and morally charged. One of the most distinctive features of the Book of Enoch is its treatment of history as a measured process rather than an open-ended flow. Events are not merely remembered, they are scheduled. The future is not vague. It is partitioned. In some sections of the text, history is divided into symbolic weeks, each marked by characteristic patterns of righteousness, corruption, judgment, and renewal. The effect is not predictive in a modern sense. It is interpretive. The past is reorganized to reveal meaning, and the future is framed as the completion of patterns already set in motion. This way of thinking reflects a profound shift in historical consciousness. Earlier, biblical narratives often explained events retrospectively. Disaster followed disobedience, restoration followed repentance. The Enochic worldview, by contrast, assumes that causality operates on scales too large to be immediately visible. Individual actions matter, but they unfold within epochs whose moral trajectories are already defined. For communities living under repeated domination, this model offered psychological resilience. If injustice persisted, despite faithfulness, it was not because faith had failed. It was because the current age had not yet reached its appointed end. Suffering was not evidence against order. It was evidence that history was still incomplete. The calendrical sections of the Book of Enoch reinforce this logic. Detailed descriptions of solar cycles, lunar movements, and intercalations are not ornamental. They serve to anchor morality in cosmic regularity. Time itself is governed. The heavens move according to law. Deviations are not signs of freedom, but of error. This emphasis stands in sharp contrast to surrounding cultures, where celestial knowledge was often associated with divination and manipulation. In Enochic thought, astronomy becomes a form of obedience. The stars do not predict the future. They testify to order. Their reliability is an argument against chaos. The implication is subtle but far-reaching. If the universe operates according to fixed principles, then moral order is not arbitrary. Judgment is not reactive. It is structural. The future does not emerge from improvisation, but from alignment or misalignment with patterns that already exist. This approach also reshapes the concept of agency. Humans are not portrayed as passive victims of cosmic forces, nor as autonomous authors of destiny. They are participants within a system that rewards orientation rather than control. Righteousness does not alter the schedule of history, but it determines one's position within it. Such a framework inevitably raises questions about freedom. If epics are predetermined, what room remains for choice? The Book of Enoch does not resolve this tension explicitly. Instead, it reframes the question. Freedom lies not in changing outcomes, but in responding to them correctly. Alignment replaces intervention as the primary moral act. This reframing helps explain the text's endurance. It does not promise escape from history, but comprehension of it. Understanding becomes a survival strategy. To know where one stands in the moral architecture of time is to endure uncertainty without surrendering meaning. At the same time, this system intensifies the stakes of interpretation. If history is already structured, then misreading it becomes dangerous. False confidence, premature certainty, and misplaced hope are not merely errors. They are forms of misalignment. The Enochic tradition therefore places great weight on correct perception. This concern surfaces repeatedly in warnings against deception. False teachers, misleading visions, and corrupted knowledge are portrayed as threats not because they introduce novelty, but because they distort orientation. To misunderstand the times is to act at the wrong moment in the wrong way. The watcher's transgression can be reread in this light. Their crime was not simply that they taught forbidden arts. It was that they disrupted timing. Knowledge was introduced before humanity was prepared to integrate it. The result was acceleration without wisdom, power without proportion. In response, the Enochic worldview elevates patience as a moral virtue. Waiting is not passive resignation. It is disciplined alignment with a process that cannot be rushed. Those who endure without despair demonstrate trust in the underlying order. This ethic would later resonate strongly with apocalyptic movements that emphasize vigilance rather than rebellion. The righteous are not called to force the end. They are called to remain oriented until it arrives. As these ideas accumulated, the Book of Enoch began to function less like a single text and more like an interpretive lens. It offered a way of reading reality that could absorb new events without losing coherence. Empires could rise and fall. Catastrophes could occur. None of these required revision of the core framework. They merely confirmed that history was still unfolding within its appointed structure. But this very adaptability carried a cost. A worldview capable of integrating endless contingency without collapsing also resists closure. It invites ongoing speculation. It generates further visions, further interpretations, further elaborations. For communities seeking doctrinal stability, this openness was unsettling. The tension between interpretive richness and institutional clarity would become increasingly pronounced. As religious authorities moved toward fixed canons and standardized teachings, texts that encouraged expansive cosmological imagination became liabilities. The Book of Enoch did not fade because it failed to explain the world. It faded because it explained too much, too broadly, and with too many moving parts. Yet at the moment of its composition and early transmission, this expansiveness was precisely its strength. It met uncertainty with structure, injustice with scale, and suffering with coherence. It offered not answers to immediate questions, but a framework capable of holding unanswered ones. In the next phase of its story, this framework will encounter the pressures of canon formation. The question will shift from what the Book of Enoch reveals to what communities are willing to authorize as revelation. And the criteria for that authorization will prove narrower than the cosmos Enoch describes. As the Enochic worldview matured, it began to intersect directly with institutions that were themselves undergoing transformation. Texts were no longer transmitted only within small interpretive communities. They were being weighed, compared, and increasingly evaluated for suitability within emerging frameworks of authority. What had once been fluid was becoming bounded. This process did not begin with Christianity. It began earlier, within Judaism itself, as the aftermath of catastrophe forced reconsideration of what could be preserved, taught, and standardized. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE marked a turning point. With the cultic center gone, continuity had to be secured through texts, practices, and interpretive discipline. Not every tradition could be carried forward. In this environment, certain qualities became liabilities. Speculation that extended beyond legal instruction, cosmologies that multiplied intermediaries, visions that encouraged attention toward hidden realms rather than communal life. The Book of Enoch contained all of these. Rabbinic Judaism, as it emerged, emphasized Torah as the primary axis of religious life. Authority shifted toward interpretation of law, ethical conduct, and communal regulation. Texts that did not reinforce this center were not necessarily condemned, but they were deprioritized. Over time, absence hardened into exclusion. The Enochic texts posed a particular challenge because they did not contradict the Torah directly. Instead, they reframed it within a larger cosmic system. Law remained important, but it was no longer the sole interface between humanity and divine order. Angels administered justice. Heavenly courts recorded deeds. Judgment unfolded across epochs rather than generations. For a tradition seeking clarity, this layering was problematic. It risked diluting responsibility. If cosmic forces bore primary blame for corruption, what role remained for human obedience? If judgment was deferred to an unseen future, how could accountability be enforced in the present? These were not abstract concerns. They touched the core of communal stability. The process of exclusion, however, was neither formal nor dramatic. There is no record of a council declaring the Book of Enoch heretical. Instead, it gradually disappeared from the corpus of texts copied, studied, and transmitted within rabbinic circles. Silence replaced engagement. A similar pattern unfolded in early Christianity, though for different reasons. The first generations of Christian writers were clearly familiar with Enochic traditions. The language of fallen angels, chains of darkness, and impending judgment appears in several early texts. One New Testament letter explicitly cites Enoch as prophecy. But as Christian theology developed, new priorities emerged. Christology, salvation, and ecclesial authority took center stage. Texts that complicated angelology or introduced parallel systems of mediation became increasingly uncomfortable. The simplicity of salvation through Christ sat uneasily alongside elaborate cosmologies in which angels played decisive roles. Again, exclusion was gradual. Enoch was read, referenced, and debated, but it did not secure a stable place within the developing canon. The same qualities that once made it compelling, its scope, its ambition, its cosmic reach, now counted against it. What is often misunderstood is that this process did not render the Book of Enoch false. It rendered it inconvenient. Canon formation is not a referendum on truth. It is a negotiation over authority. A canon defines which texts may speak decisively, not which texts may speak at all. In narrowing the field, traditions protect coherence, but they also limit imagination. The survival of the Book of Enoch within Ethiopian Christianity highlights this contingency. Isolated from the doctrinal battles of the Mediterranean world, Ethiopian communities inherited a broader textual tradition. Enoch remained scripture not because it was rediscovered, but because it was never relinquished. This continuity complicates any narrative of suppression. There was no universal verdict. There were multiple trajectories, shaped by geography, politics, and institutional need. By the late antique period, the fate of the Book of Enoch had largely been decided outside Ethiopia. It circulated as a reference, a curiosity, a source of imagery, but no longer as an authoritative voice. Its cosmology lingered at the margins, influencing art, liturgy, and popular belief without direct endorsement. Yet even in absence, its influence persisted. Concepts central to later religious imagination, fallen angels, final judgment, cosmic books, divided afterlives, bear unmistakable Enochic traces. The text had been sidelined, but its architecture remained embedded. This paradox reveals something essential about how traditions evolve. Ideas are not eliminated simply by excluding their sources. They are absorbed, reshaped, and redistributed. The Book of Enoch did not disappear. It dissolved into the background. Understanding this process reframes the question of why Enoch was left out. It was not rejected because it contradicted belief. It was set aside because it expanded belief in directions institutions could not easily regulate. In the next stage of this story, the modern rediscovery of Enochic fragments will force a reassessment of these boundaries. Texts long treated as peripheral will re-enter scholarly conversation, not as threats to canon, but as witnesses to the complexity of the world that produced it. What had been narrowed will widen again, not through restoration, but through understanding. When the fragments of Enochic literature resurfaced in the modern era, they did not arrive as revelations. They arrived as evidence. Weathered, incomplete, and embedded among dozens of other texts, they force scholars to confront a quieter, more unsettling realization. The boundaries of ancient religious thought had never been as clean as later traditions suggested. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not elevate the Book of Enoch to canonical status. They did something more disruptive. They placed it firmly inside the intellectual world of Second Temple Judaism. The text was no longer a peripheral curiosity preserved only in distant Ethiopia. It was now demonstrably present, copied, and circulated alongside texts that would later become foundational. This proximity changed the conversation. Before Qumran, Enoch could be treated as an outlier, interesting, influential, but fundamentally separate. After Qumran, that position became difficult to maintain. The same communities that preserved proto-biblical texts also preserved Enochic ones. The distinction between scripture and non-scripture was not yet settled. Authority was negotiated, not inherited. This realization reframed canon formation as a process rather than an event. Texts competed for attention, interpretation, and transmission. Some were copied more frequently. Some were read more widely. Some aligned more closely with emerging institutional needs. Others did not. The Book of Enoch belonged to this contested space. Its presence among the scrolls suggests that it spoke to real concerns. It was not read for entertainment or novelty. It addressed questions of evil, justice, and cosmic order in ways that resonated with communities living under pressure. The fact that multiple copies existed implies sustained interest over time. Yet even within this environment, Enochim was not uncontested. The diversity of texts at Qumran reflects diversity of thought. Apocalyptic visions coexisted with legal commentaries, hymns, and interpretive rewritings of Scripture. No single worldview dominated. What mattered was usefulness, whether a text helped a community understand its place in history. The Enochic framework did that effectively, but it did so by expanding the scale of explanation beyond what later traditions would tolerate. Modern scholarship has approached this tension cautiously. The rediscovery of Enochic material did not prompt calls to revise religious canons. Instead, it prompted questions about historical development. How did ideas evolve? Which concepts were central and which were provisional. How much diversity existed before consolidation occurred? In this context, the Book of Enoch has become a lens rather than a battleground. It allows scholars to trace the emergence of apocalyptic thought, angelology, and cosmic judgment without projecting later theological conclusions backward. It illuminates a stage of religious imagination that was exploratory rather than fixed. What emerges from this study is not a story of loss, but of narrowing. Early traditions entertained multiple models of how divine order interacted with history. Over time, some models were privileged, others sidelined. The Enochic model, with its elaborate hierarchies and delayed justice, proved difficult to institutionalize. But difficulty is not insignificance. The rediscovered fragments also reveal something about how ancient readers engaged with texts. They copied, adapted, and reinterpreted rather than preserving verbatim. Authority lay not in static wording, but in continued relevance. A text survived if it could be reread meaningfully in new circumstances. Seen this way, the Book of Enoch did not fail to endure. It adapted differently. Its survival outside the canon allowed it to influence thought without being constrained by formal doctrine. Its ideas circulated informally, shaping imagination rather than instruction. This informal influence is visible in later literature, art, and popular belief. Images of chained angels, heavenly books, and cosmic courts recur across centuries. They do not always carry Enoch's name, but they carry his architecture. The modern encounter with Enoch, therefore, is not about recovery in a religious sense. It is about recognition. Recognition that the ancient Near East was intellectually plural, that early Judaism and Christianity were shaped by a wider range of ideas than later boundaries admit, and that exclusion from canon does not equate to exclusion from influence. As scholarship continues to map this landscape, the Book of Enoch occupies a stable, if unconventional, position. It is no longer mysterious in origin, nor marginal in importance. It is a witness, imperfect, composite, and expansive, to a period when religious imagination had not yet been fully disciplined. In the chapters that remain, attention will shift from rediscovery to legacy. The question will no longer be where the Book of Enoch fits historically, but why its themes continue to surface whenever societies confront injustice, delay, and the problem of unseen order. The text may no longer speak with canonical authority, but it has not fallen silent. It persists wherever people seek meaning beyond the immediate and structure beyond the visible. And that persistence suggests that some questions once asked do not belong to any single tradition. They belong to history itself. By the time the Book of Enoch re-enters modern awareness, it does so in a world shaped by very different assumptions about truth, authority, and history. Ancient texts are no longer approached primarily as vessels of revelation, but as artifacts, products of particular times, communities, and needs. This shift does not diminish their significance. It reframes it. Within this framework, the Book of Enoch becomes a case study in how religious ideas evolve under pressure. Its composite nature, once seen as a weakness, now reads as evidence of continuity. The text did not emerge fully formed. It accumulated layers as circumstances changed, absorbing new anxieties and refracting them through an existing cosmological lens. This adaptability explains both its early appeal and its eventual marginalization. The Enochic worldview was expansive enough to integrate conquest, exile, injustice, and delay without collapsing. But that same expansiveness resisted the kind of doctrinal closure institutions require to govern communities over long periods. Modern scholars have noted that many of the themes once considered excessive or speculative now appear foundational. Concepts such as a final judgment, moral accountability beyond death, and the recording of deeds are no longer peripheral within Western religious imagination. They are central. The irony is that these ideas often entered the mainstream stripped of their original cosmological frameworks. In this sense, the Book of Enoch functions like an underground river. Its surface presence receded, but its influence continued to shape the terrain above it. Later, traditions absorbed its imagery selectively, retaining what could be integrated and discarding what could not. This selective inheritance has consequences. Without the broader system Enoch provides, certain concepts become abstracted. Judgment becomes moral rather than cosmic. Evil becomes psychological rather than structural. Responsibility narrows to individual action, detached from larger patterns. The Enochic worldview resists this narrowing. It insists that individual choices occur within inherited conditions, that history exerts pressure, that not all suffering can be traced to immediate fault. This does not eliminate responsibility, but it complicates it. Such complexity sits uneasily within modern frameworks that favor clarity and causation. Yet it mirrors lived experience more closely than simpler models. Few people experience injustice as the direct result of a single choice. More often, they encounter systems already in motion, rules already written, outcomes already tilted. The Book of Enoch speaks to this reality without offering escape. It does not promise that understanding will change circumstances. It promises that circumstances are intelligible. This may explain why Enoch continues to resurface at moments of cultural stress. When institutions lose credibility, when explanations feel inadequate, when delay erodes trust, the appeal of a hidden order intensifies. The idea that reality is governed by structures beyond immediate visibility offers coherence when surface narratives fail. At the same time, modern engagement with Enoch is cautious. Scholars resist romanticizing it as suppressed truth or lost wisdom. Its value lies not in what it proves, but in what it reveals about the range of possibilities once considered viable. The Book of Enoch reminds us that ancient religious thought was not monolithic. It experimented, it debated, it imagined multiple solutions to the same problems. Canon formation narrowed those options, but it did not retroactively erase them. In this light, Enoch is not an anomaly. It is a snapshot of a moment before consolidation, when uncertainty had not yet been disciplined into orthodoxy. Its visions preserve the traces of that uncertainty, structured but unresolved. The modern reader encounters these traces differently than ancient audiences did. The cosmology may feel distant. The angelic hierarchies may seem elaborate, but the underlying questions remain recognizable. Why does injustice persist? Where is accountability located? How does one live meaningfully within a system that appears indifferent? The Book of Enoch does not answer these questions directly. It reframes them. It suggests that the scale of the problem exceeds the scale of immediate solutions. That meaning may reside not in resolution, but in orientation. This reframing carries both comfort and discomfort. Comfort because it restores coherence. Discomfort because it denies immediacy. There is no shortcut to justice in the Enochic world. There is only endurance within a structure that promises eventual reckoning. As the narrative draws closer to its conclusion, this tension becomes more pronounced. The text does not culminate in triumph. It culminates in certainty. The assurance that order exists, even if it remains hidden, becomes the final stabilizing force. This is the legacy the Book of Enoch leaves behind. Not doctrine, not prophecy, but a way of seeing, a framework capable of holding contradiction without dissolving into chaos. In the final chapter, attention will turn to that legacy explicitly, not to argue for restoration or authority, but to ask why a text left outside official boundaries continues to feel relevant, why its questions persist, and why, in moments of uncertainty, the idea of a hidden order remains so difficult to relinquish. The endurance of the Book of Enoch raises a question that cannot be answered by history alone. If the text no longer holds canonical authority for most traditions, why does it continue to be read, discussed, and revisited? Why does a work so deeply embedded in an ancient worldview still resonate in cultures far removed from its original context? Part of the answer lies in what the Book of Enoch refuses to simplify. Where many traditions eventually streamline their explanations of evil, responsibility, and justice, Enoch preserves complexity. It does not reduce suffering to a single cause. It does not collapse moral failure into individual weakness alone. Instead, it insists that history unfolds within inherited conditions, shaped by decisions made long before any single person enters the scene. This insistence mirrors how people experience the world. Few lives begin on level ground. Inequality, violence, and instability are often structural, not accidental. The Enochic worldview names this reality without normalizing it. Corruption is not accepted as natural. It is traced to rupture, an ancient violation that continues to distort the present. At the same time, the text resists despair. Structure implies intelligibility. Even if the system is damaged, it is not arbitrary. There are rules. There is memory. There is accountability. Nothing disappears into meaninglessness. This balance between realism and coherence gives the Book of Enoch its lasting power. It does not promise rescue from history. It promises that history is not ultimate. Modern readers, even those far removed from religious belief, often respond to this posture intuitively. The idea that actions are recorded, that consequences accumulate, that time itself carries moral weight. These are not alien concepts. They surface in secular language as systems, feedback loops, and long-term effects. Enoch articulates them mythically, but the underlying logic remains familiar. The text's emphasis on hidden order also speaks to moments of institutional failure. When visible authorities lose credibility, attention turns elsewhere, not necessarily toward rebellion, but toward alternative explanations. The Book of Enoch offers one such explanation: that authority may exist without visibility, and that justice may operate beyond the reach of immediate power. This does not make Enoch a manual for resistance. It makes it a resource for endurance. Endurance in the Enochic sense is not passive, it is interpretive. It requires learning to read the world differently, to see delay as part of process, and suffering as evidence of scale rather than absence. This reframing does not remove pain, but it prevents it from becoming meaningless. The persistence of Enochic themes across centuries suggests that this reframing meets a recurring human need. Each era encounters its own forms of injustice and delay. Each seeks explanations that can hold those experiences without collapsing into cynicism or denial. The Book of Enoch does not offer optimism. It offers orientation. Orientation, once established, changes how one moves through uncertainty. It does not shorten the journey, but it clarifies direction. In this sense, the text functions less like prophecy and more like cartography. It maps a moral universe in which suffering is not random and justice is not improvisational. This may be why Enoch continues to surface at the edges of canon, scholarship, and popular imagination. It occupies a space between belief and analysis, myth and reflection. It does not demand assent. It invites consideration. In the end, the Book of Enoch remains what it has always been, a witness to a moment when religious imagination was expansive enough to confront disorder without reducing it. Its exclusion from canon did not erase its insights. It merely changed how they were transmitted. To read Enoch today is not to recover a lost authority. It is to encounter an ancient attempt to think honestly about a world that feels unbalanced, delayed, and unresolved. That attempt may not offer answers suited to modern expectations, but it offers something rarer, a framework that acknowledges uncertainty without surrendering coherence. And perhaps that is why, long after its visions faded from liturgy and law, the Book of Enoch continues to be read. Not because it explains everything, but because it refuses to pretend that everything is simple. The final movement of the Book of Enoch does not resolve its tensions. It formalizes them. The visions culminate not in narrative closure, but in moral certainty. Judgment is affirmed, order is reaffirmed, yet the world as experienced by the reader remains unchanged. History continues. Injustice persists. The distance between promise and fulfillment remains intact. This is not a failure of imagination. It is a deliberate stance. The Enochic worldview refuses to collapse the future into the present. It insists that meaning does not require immediacy. Resolution is not a prerequisite for coherence. In doing so, the text stands apart from traditions that seek to align divine justice too closely with observable outcomes. Enoch does not offer confirmation through success. It offers confirmation through structure. That structure is its final claim. The cosmos Enoch describes is not a metaphorical backdrop for human drama. It is the arena in which all drama unfolds. Human history occupies a narrow band within it, significant but not sovereign. This decentering is unsettling. It strips individuals and institutions of ultimate authority. It reframes achievement and failure alike as provisional. Such a perspective carries ethical consequences. If outcomes are deferred, then action cannot be justified by results alone. Righteousness becomes a matter of alignment rather than reward. The measure of a life is not its visible impact, but its orientation toward an order that transcends immediate calculation. This ethic challenges both triumphalism and despair. It denies the victor the comfort of finality and denies the sufferer the verdict of meaninglessness. Both are subject to a scale that outlasts them. The Book of Enoch thus closes not with reassurance, but with discipline. It asks its readers to inhabit uncertainty without surrendering judgment, to accept delay without abandoning expectation, to recognize that history may be intelligible even when it feels unjust. In this sense, the text offers neither escape nor consolation. It offers endurance grounded in interpretation. That endurance depends on memory. Enoch is shown books because books preserve what time erodes. They record what power would prefer to forget. The insistence that deeds are written is not merely theological, it is political. It asserts that no authority can fully control narrative, that no act disappears without trace. This insistence resonates across centuries precisely because it addresses a recurring fear, that suffering vanishes without acknowledgement. The Enochic answer is uncompromising. Nothing vanishes. Delay is not erasure. Yet the text also acknowledges the cost of this stance. To live within such a framework is to accept tension as permanent. There is no moment when uncertainty dissolves completely. Faith, in the Enochic sense, is not confidence in outcomes. It is commitment to orientation despite incomplete information. This is perhaps why the Book of Enoch was never easily institutionalized. Institutions prefer clarity that can be administered. The Enochic worldview resists administration. It expands horizons rather than narrowing them. It multiplies intermediaries rather than streamlining authority. It invites contemplation where regulation seeks closure. And yet, this resistance is also its legacy. The Book of Enoch survives not as doctrine, but as a reminder that ancient traditions were capable of complexity, that they grappled with injustice without denying order, that they imagined systems vast enough to hold contradiction without dissolving into chaos. To encounter Enoch today is not to step backward into superstition. It is to encounter a mode of thought that refuses reduction. It does not ask to be believed. It asks to be understood. In the end, the Book of Enoch leaves its reader where it began, at the edge of the visible world, looking inward and outward at once. It offers no final image of resolution. It offers a framework for living with unresolved time, and perhaps that is its quiet, enduring significance. Not that it explains the world, but that it insists the world is explainable, even when explanation requires patience, scale, and a willingness to live without immediate answers. With that insistence, the Book of Enoch completes its task, not by closing history, but by widening the lens through which history is seen. What remains after the Book of Enoch has spoken is not a doctrine to enforce, but a perspective to reckon with. Its removal from canonical boundaries did not mark an ending. It marked a repositioning. Enoch was pushed to the margins of authorized teaching, but those margins proved porous. Ideas do not respect borders drawn after the fact. Across centuries, elements of the Enochic worldview resurfaced wherever communities struggled to articulate injustice without surrendering meaning. They appeared in theological debates about angels and demons, in medieval visions of heaven and hell, in poetic accounts of judgment, and later in philosophical reflections on history and responsibility. Rarely was Enoch named. His influence moved anonymously, carried by concepts rather than citations. This anonymity is significant. It suggests that the power of the text lies not in its authority, but in its architecture. The framework it provides of delayed justice, recorded deeds, and a moral universe larger than immediate experience can be detached from its original mythological language and reinterpreted across contexts. It adapts because it does not demand uniform belief. It offers coherence without requiring consensus. Modern engagement with Enoch often oscillates between fascination and caution. Scholars emphasize its historical value, situating it carefully within Second Temple Judaism. Popular culture, by contrast, tends to isolate its most dramatic elements: fallen angels, forbidden knowledge, cosmic rebellion, and amplify them. Both approaches risk distortion. One can flatten the text into artifact, the other can inflate it into spectacle. What the Book of Enoch resists most strongly is reduction. It cannot be fully absorbed into theology, mythology, or literature alone. It sits uncomfortably between them, refusing to resolve into a single category. This refusal is part of its integrity. It reflects a time when boundaries between genres were still permeable, when explanation had not yet been disciplined into distinct compartments. The persistence of Enochic themes also reveals something about how traditions remember. Canon formation narrows what is taught, but it does not erase what is imagined. Images, metaphors, and narrative structures often survive independently of the texts that introduce them. They circulate beneath the surface, shaping intuition long after their sources are forgotten. In this sense, the Book of Enoch functions less like a suppressed book and more like a submerged foundation. It supports structures that no longer acknowledge it. Judgment scenes, cosmic hierarchies, and moral accounting systems that feel familiar today owe part of their shape to Enochic imagination, even when they appear in radically different guises. This continuity challenges simple narratives of progress. Ideas do not evolve in straight lines from primitive to refined. They fracture, recombine, and reappear. What is excluded at one moment may become indispensable at another. The Book of Enoch exemplifies this cycle. Its marginalization did not diminish its relevance. It altered the conditions under which it could speak. The text also invites reflection on the limits of institutional control. Religious authorities can determine which texts are read aloud, copied, and taught, but they cannot fully regulate how ideas migrate. Once released into cultural circulation, concepts take on lives of their own. They are reinterpreted by poets, artists, mystics, and philosophers, often in ways institutions did not anticipate. The Enochic worldview, with its emphasis on hidden order and delayed reckoning, proved especially resilient because it addressed experiences that recur across time. Societies repeatedly encounter moments when visible systems fail to deliver justice. In those moments, the question is not whether order exists, but where it resides. Enoch's answer: that order exists beyond immediate perception, embedded in structures larger than history, has never lost its appeal. It offers a way to think about responsibility without demanding immediate resolution. It allows meaning to persist in the absence of closure. This does not make the Book of Enoch a solution. It makes it a companion to unresolved questions. To read it today, with historical distance and critical awareness, is to encounter a tradition wrestling openly with uncertainty. Its authors did not assume that the world was simple. They assumed it was intelligible, even if that intelligibility required imagination, patience, and scale. That assumption stands in contrast to both cynicism and dogmatism. Cynicism denies order altogether. Dogmatism claims to possess it fully. The Book of Enoch occupies the space between, affirming order while acknowledging that it remains partially hidden. As the narrative of this documentary approaches its close, the significance of Enoch lies not in whether it should be restored to canon, nor in whether its cosmology should be believed. It lies in what it reveals about the human effort to understand a world that resists easy explanation. The ancient Near East that produced the Book of Enoch was a world of upheaval, empire, and uncertainty. In that environment, thinkers reached for frameworks capable of holding contradiction without collapse. Enoch is one such framework. Its survival, fragmented, translated, and transformed, testifies to the durability of that effort, not because it succeeded conclusively, but because it refused to surrender the question. And perhaps that is why the Book of Enoch still feels unfinished. Not because something is missing, but because its task was never to conclude. It was to orient, to provide a way of standing within unresolved time without losing sight of coherence. In that sense, Enoch remains what it always was, a witness, not to final answers, but to the possibility that history, however fractured, still belongs to an order larger than itself. The story of the Book of Enoch ultimately returns to the question with which it began, not whether the world is ordered, but whether that order can be trusted when it remains unseen. The ancient authors who shaped this tradition did not write from a position of security. They wrote from within instability, fragmentation, and loss. Their confidence was not rooted in circumstance, it was constructed. This construction required imagination, disciplined by structure. The Enochic universe is expansive, but it is not chaotic. Every vision is bounded. Every journey has guides. Every revelation is contextualized within a hierarchy that limits what any being, human or angelic, may do. Even rebellion operates within constraints. This insistence on constraint is often overlooked. The Book of Enoch is remembered for its fallen angels and cosmic drama, but its deeper commitment is to order. Disorder is not celebrated, it is diagnosed. Transgression is not romanticized, it is cataloged and confined. In this way, the text draws a sharp line between explanation and endorsement. To explain the origins of corruption is not to excuse it. To map the structure of evil is not to legitimize it. The Enochic authors were keenly aware of this distinction, and they guarded it carefully. This caution helps explain the text's restraint. Despite its vast cosmology, it avoids detailed prescriptions for action. There is no program, no call to arms, no blueprint for reform. The reader is not instructed to imitate Enoch. They are instructed to listen to him. Listening, in this context, is an ethical act. It requires accepting limits of knowledge, of control, of immediacy. It requires acknowledging that some truths operate at scales that resist intervention. This posture runs counter to impulses toward mastery, whether technological, political, or spiritual. The Book of Enoch therefore offers a quiet critique of overreach. The watchers fall because they act prematurely and without mandate. Empires fail because they mistake dominance for permanence. Individuals suffer when they assume that visible power equates to ultimate authority. Against these patterns, Enoch stands as a figure of restraint. He does not attempt to change what he sees. He records it. He does not challenge the system. He testifies to it. His righteousness lies not in action, but in fidelity to what has been revealed. This fidelity is not passive. It is disciplined. It resists despair without claiming victory. It acknowledges injustice without denying coherence. It waits without relinquishing judgment. For the communities that preserved these texts, such a posture was not abstract. It was practical. It offered a way to endure domination without internalizing it, to live under empire without granting empire metaphysical legitimacy, to accept delay without conceding meaning. In this sense, the Book of Enoch functions as a stabilizing force. It does not mobilize resistance, but it prevents collapse. It holds open a space in which identity can persist even when institutions fail. Modern readers may find this stance difficult. Contemporary culture often equates significance with impact, meaning with change, value with results. The Enochic worldview challenges these assumptions. It suggests that orientation matters even when outcomes remain unchanged. That alignment can be meaningful without visibility. This challenge is part of the text's enduring relevance. In periods of rapid change, systemic injustice, or institutional breakdown, the pressure to act immediately can obscure the limits of action. The Book of Enoch offers a counterweight. It reminds its readers that not all problems are solvable at the scale on which they are experienced. This reminder does not absolve responsibility. It reframes it. Responsibility becomes a matter of position rather than outcome, of bearing witness rather than enforcing resolution, of preserving memory rather than controlling events. As the narrative approaches its conclusion, this reframing clarifies the text's place within the broader landscape of ancient Near Eastern thought. The Book of Enoch is not an anomaly or an aberration. It is an experiment, one among many, in how to think coherently about a world that feels fundamentally misaligned. Other traditions pursued different strategies. Some emphasized law, others emphasized ritual, still others emphasized wisdom or prophecy. The Enochic tradition emphasized scale. It expanded the frame until disorder could be seen as partial rather than total. This expansion came at a cost. Complexity resists simplification. Systems resist codification. The very qualities that made Enoch compelling also made it difficult to integrate into traditions seeking clarity and control. Exclusion was not an accident. It was a consequence. Yet exclusion did not erase the experiment. It preserved it in a different form. Freed from institutional obligation, the Book of Enoch remained available as a resource for thought rather than a rule for life. Its ideas could be borrowed, adapted, and reinterpreted without formal commitment. This flexibility ensured its survival. As the final reflections draw near, what emerges is not a verdict on the Book of Enoch's authority, but an appreciation of its function. It does not resolve the problem of evil. It reframes it. It does not shorten the distance between injustice and judgment. It renders that distance intelligible. In doing so, the Book of Enoch articulates a mode of thought that remains difficult, demanding, and, for many, necessary. It insists that coherence is possible even when resolution is not. That order can exist without immediacy. That meaning does not require closure. This insistence may be the text's most enduring contribution, not a doctrine to be enforced, but a discipline of interpretation, a way of standing within uncertainty without surrendering the conviction that history, however fractured, is not finally absurd. The Book of Enoch does not end history. It situates it. And in that act of situating, it offers its readers, ancient and modern alike, a way to endure time without being consumed by it. In the end, the Book of Enoch leaves behind neither a system to administer nor a doctrine to enforce. It leaves a posture, a way of inhabiting time when certainty is unavailable and authority feels distant. This posture is neither defiant nor resigned. It is attentive. Attention, in the Enochic sense, is moral labor. To attend is to watch without intervening, to remember without possessing, to judge without executing sentence. The text repeatedly privileges those who see clearly over those who act forcefully. Vision precedes action. Orientation precedes outcome. This emphasis reframes what it means to live faithfully within a fractured world. Faith is not measured by success or visibility. It is measured by fidelity to a structure that cannot yet be verified by results. The righteous do not prevail because they are powerful. They prevail because they remain correctly aligned, while power circulates elsewhere. Such alignment is costly. It demands patience in environments that reward speed. It demands restraint in cultures that valorize mastery. It demands trust in an order that offers no immediate proof. The Book of Enoch does not conceal these costs. It presents endurance as a discipline, not a consolation. This discipline also shapes memory. The insistence that deeds are recorded is not simply about future judgment. It is about preserving meaning across time. When actions fail to produce visible change, their inscription becomes a form of resistance against erasure. To be recorded is to matter, even when recognition is deferred. In this light, Enoch's role as scribe takes on renewed significance. He does not legislate or command. He witnesses. He ensures that what occurs within history does not vanish into obscurity. This function is ethical before it is theological. It asserts that suffering, though delayed in reckoning, is not forgotten. The appeal of such a vision is not limited to religious contexts. Secular frameworks often struggle with the same problem: how to account for harm that outlives perpetrators, for consequences that unfold beyond any single lifespan. Archives, memorials, and historical inquiry all attempt, in their own ways, to answer the Enochic insistence that nothing disappears without trace. What distinguishes the Book of Enoch is its refusal to collapse this insistence into closure. The record exists, but the verdict's not yet delivered. This open interval sustains responsibility without finality. It prevents both amnesia and premature judgment. As traditions matured and institutions solidified, this openness became increasingly difficult to sustain. Communities sought texts that could anchor practice, clarify belief, and regulate behavior. The Enochic posture, watchful, expansive, unresolved, did not easily serve those needs. Its marginalization reflects not a failure of insight, but a mismatch of function. Yet marginal spaces often preserve what centers cannot. Freed from administrative demands, the Book of Enoch retained its capacity to provoke reflection rather than obedience. It could be read without being enforced, contemplated without being codified. Its survival depended less on authority than on relevance. That relevance persists because the conditions it addresses recur. Periods of domination, systemic injustice, and delayed. And accountability are not confined to antiquity. They are features of human history. Each recurrence renews the question Enoch poses: how does one live meaningfully when outcomes are deferred? The text's answer is consistent. One lives oriented toward an order that exceeds the present. One acts responsibly without demanding confirmation. One preserves memory against erasure. One waits without surrendering judgment. This waiting is not passive. It is structured. It is informed by a map of reality that places immediate experience within a larger, slower-moving system. The map does not eliminate uncertainty. It makes uncertainty navigable. In this sense, the Book of Enoch offers not revelation in the narrow sense, but orientation in the broad one. It provides coordinates rather than commands. It situates the reader within time rather than extracting them from it. As the documentary approaches its final chapter, this orientation becomes its central legacy. The question is no longer whether Enoch belongs inside or outside a canon. It is whether the posture it embodies remains viable. The answer, suggested by the text's persistence, is yes. Whenever societies confront injustice that resists correction, whenever power operates without accountability, whenever history feels stalled between promise and fulfillment, The Enochic posture reemerges. It offers coherence without closure, judgment without immediacy, meaning without simplification. That this posture continues to be recognizable suggests that the Book of Enoch addressed a structural problem rather than a temporary one. Its vision was shaped by ancient circumstances, but its logic was not confined to them. In bearing witness to a hidden order without demanding its immediate manifestation, the Book of Enoch articulated a discipline of endurance that remains difficult, demanding, and for many, necessary. It did not claim to resolve history. It claimed that history was resolvable. And in the space between those claims, it found its enduring voice. The Book of Enoch does not end with a final vision meant to be memorized or a command meant to be obeyed. It ends instead with a horizon, a line beyond which the text refuses to speak with certainty. This refusal is deliberate. It preserves the distinction that has structured the entire work between what can be seen and what must be waited for. Throughout its visions, the Book of Enoch insists that the world is intelligible without being immediately just. That order exists without being fully visible. That judgment is certain without being accessible on demand. These claims do not resolve the tensions they describe. They stabilize them. This stabilization is the text's final achievement. By the time Enoch's testimony reaches its conclusion, the reader has been trained to inhabit delay. Catastrophe has been explained without being undone. Corruption has been traced without being instantly corrected. The architecture of justice has been revealed, but its execution remains deferred. Nothing collapses. Nothing concludes. What remains is orientation. This orientation does not promise clarity in every moment. It promises coherence across time. The Book of Enoch offers a way to understand history not as a sequence of disconnected failures, but as a process unfolding within constraints that exceed any single generation. It asks its readers to locate meaning not in outcomes, but in alignment with an order that moves more slowly than human expectation. Such a perspective is demanding. It resists both despair and triumphalism. It denies the comfort of final answers while refusing the nihilism of randomness. It requires the reader to accept that significance may outlast visibility and that justice may operate beyond the horizon of personal experience. This demand explains both the power of the Book of Enoch and the difficulty of containing it. Institutions that require closure, clarity, and administrative authority cannot easily accommodate a worldview that privileges scale over immediacy. Canon formation narrowed what could speak decisively, not because alternative voices lacked insight, but because they resisted finality. The exclusion of Enoch was therefore not a verdict on its value. It was a decision about manageability. Yet the text's survival, fragmented, translated, preserved in unexpected places, demonstrates that manageability is not the only measure of endurance. Ideas that articulate persistent human dilemmas do not require official sanction to remain alive. They persist because they continue to describe experience accurately. The Book of Enoch describes a world in which injustice is systemic, accountability is delayed, and authority is often invisible. These conditions are not confined to antiquity. They recur whenever power outpaces responsibility and outcomes fail to align with effort. Each recurrence renews the relevance of Enoch's posture. That posture is neither passive nor revolutionary. It is watchful. It affirms that actions matter even when results do not confirm it. It insists that history is being recorded even when recognition is withheld. It locates responsibility within a structure larger than any immediate system of reward or punishment. This insistence gives the text its quiet resilience. It does not offer solutions that can be implemented. It offers a framework that can be inhabited. One can live within it without expecting resolution on demand. One can endure without surrendering judgment. One can act responsibly without requiring confirmation. For modern readers, this framework may feel unfamiliar precisely because it resists instrumentalization. It does not ask what works. It asks what aligns. It does not measure success by impact. It measures fidelity by position within an order that remains partially hidden. The Book of Enoch closes by leaving its reader where it has always placed Enoch himself, between worlds. A witness who sees more than others, but controls nothing. A recorder who preserves a meaning without dictating outcomes. A figure whose authority lies not in power, but in attention. This is not an ending designed to satisfy. It is an ending designed to endure. The ancient Near East that produced the Book of Enoch was a world of empire, loss, and uncertainty. In response, its thinkers did not simplify reality to make it bearable. They expanded the frame until contradiction could be held without collapse. They imagined systems large enough to account for delay without denying order. That imaginative effort is the true legacy of the Book of Enoch. It does not tell us what will happen next. It tells us how to stand while history continues. It offers not a conclusion, but a discipline, to remain oriented toward coherence, even when coherence cannot yet be verified. In that sense, the Book of Enoch remains unfinished, not because it failed to conclude, but because it never intended to. Its task was not to close history, but to keep it intelligible. And as long as history continues to feel unresolved, that task remains necessary.